Hello, welcome back. I'm now on Chapter 9 of David Scharff's great book, The Sexual Relationship. Chapter 9 is entitled The Parents' Function as Parents, Problems in Sexual Identity. Now, he begins this chapter with a quote from Heinz Lichtenstein. Dr. Lichtenstein wrote an article many years ago called Sexuality and Identity. I can strongly recommend it. It's been one of the foundational texts in my understanding both of child development, adolescent development, and adult sexuality. The quote goes like this: "The mother does not convey a sense of identity to the infant, but an identity. The child is the organ, the instrument for the fulfillment of the mother's unconscious needs. Out of the infinite potentialities within the human infant, the specific stimulus combination emanating from the individual mother releases one and only one concrete way of being this organ, this instrument." Now, that's a complicated bit of language, but I think his message is clear. The child doesn't simply grow up. It has to be raised. And in that developmental dynamic between the mother, the parents, and the child, there is a very specific set of internalizations, identifications. The child, in some ways, becomes the child the mother sees. The child becomes the sum total of the introjects, the identifications, what the child takes in from the unconscious, from the mind of the mother in a very particular and unique way. The influence, the power of the parental dynamic over the child's development, I think, is just now starting to become more clear. The problems that the patients that Dr. Scharff describes in this chapter, he ascribes primarily to something being derailed in this developmental sequence, something being derailed in the relationship between the mother and the child, and including here always the father as well. Dr. Scharff states, "The patients struggled with problems in sexual and gender identity as a solution to early experience with both mother and father. Issues between the parents were focused on the child instead of being resolved within the couple. In all three of these cases, experience of parents as intrusive and yet deficient was critical to the child's development." Now, I think what he's describing here is a bit of a tip of an iceberg, but it's a very dangerous iceberg. I don't think in psychology today there is any more dangerous, politically loaded topic than the question of child development around the question of homosexual development, gay and lesbian development, transgender, and the various other categories that are now listed in DSM-5 as either dysfunctions or paraphilias, what used to be called perversions. Now, it's pretty clear since 1905 that following Freud, that we have no justification for deciding that homosexuality itself is any kind of disorder. Freud put that to rest in 1905. Unfortunately, at a cultural level, at least in America and also in Europe as well, starting in the mid-50s after the death of Freud in 1938-39, we had a regression in my field that the American Psychiatric Association declared homosexuality, again, as it was prior to Freud, a deviation, a perversion, a mental illness, and until 1972, that was the ideology. It wasn't until 1972 that we effectively went back to Freud to declare homosexuality and heterosexuality developmental tracks down which an individual could go without being labeled mentally ill. There are, however, tracks down which we go which are still considered, at the very least, disorders, and in the worst cases, paraphilias, or as I said, perversions. That word is perversions is falling out of favor quite rapidly these days. The problem is that we are now getting into a way of understanding sexuality that seems to have swung to the opposite extreme. Freud broke us out of a rigid, moralistic, Victorian approach to sexuality. We seem now to have, the pendulum has swung to the other extreme where there seems to be a movement, plastic sexuality, deconstruction, a rampant subjectivity in sexual response where the almost unspoken assumption is there aren't any standards at all, that whatever feels good, go ahead and do it, that no one can judge anyone else's sexuality. And the problem is that seems to me as problematic as Freud's prior to Freud's, the Victorian moralism. It seems almost now like a new kind of orthodoxy, a new kind of moralism. And I think what I'm trying to do in the literature I'm reading is trying to purvey is a sense of Aristotle's golden mean, somewhere in the middle. We don't want a rigid moralism. We want to be able to look at the clinical data. We want to look at human nature. We want to look at both our biology and the developmental dynamics in individuals and try to understand what works for them, what makes them stronger, what helps them cope with reality, what reflects in them an internalized and unconscious character development, how that manifests in the world that they are in, struggling with issues of sexuality as we go. It doesn't seem to help to jettison all standards. Now, I'm going to spend another lecture later on the details of this, but for purposes of wrapping up Dr. Scharff, we have to be simply aware that there is a political movement afoot that makes a dispassionate discussion of sexuality very, very difficult and frankly dangerous. People get criticized, people get attacked in print and in otherwise by taking a position that seems to the modern moralist heretical. Heresies have always been punished, and one has to be careful in this field. So I'm going to do my best to try to stay somewhere in the middle, and frankly, even that's a dangerous position sometimes. Dr. Scharff's position, which in this case I disagree with in some very particular ways, I think his fundamental position is unassailable, that it is a combination of genetics and environment that develops in concert. Whatever particular sexual characterological result we have as adolescents and adults. He holds that, and I think in this way he is somewhat at odds with the mainstream here, whatever that means these days, is that he privileges more directly than most the developmental dynamics within the family, that he sees patterns. And I think anybody in my clinical field who's been doing this work for more than a couple of days will confirm that there are familial patterns that reflect fairly consistency, certain developmental dynamics. I think everyone sees this in other dysfunctions or mental illness categories, anxiety disorders, mood disorders. We see without much difficulty how family dynamics contribute to that. The question becomes, why isn't that a completely reasonable position to take on the question of sexual development? And the answer is, it's too personal. That Lichtenstein's great article, Sexuality and Identity, pointed out rightly that there simply isn't any getting away from the coexistence of sexuality and identity. Nobody in this world lives with an identity here and a sex life somehow over there separate. We are our sex lives, and that makes discussions of sexuality incredibly and intensely personal very quickly, and that evokes anxiety if opinions differ in any way. And if they differ a great deal, it can evoke an angry response. I think that, in summary, is the biggest problem with research in sexuality today. The problem is we can almost not get any reliable data, any real scientifically valid research, because the very subject which we are researching is so fraught with personal, intense, emotional, and frankly, most of the time unconscious reactions that the simple truth is no one tells the truth about their sexual life when they're talking to researchers. The data is speculative at best, so we struggle as clinicians and as theoreticians trying to make sense of what is inherently inaccurate data in a field where political positions seem to be the norm. And I have to confess, it's very confusing and very frustrating. So this is the best I can do with what I have now. I assume if I give this lecture in 10 years, maybe even 5 years, I'm going to come to very different conclusions. What I'm asking is for some patience and some empathy for someone struggling in a very complicated field. Take these ideas as tentative at best, as hopeful, as indications of where we've been and where we're heading. Certainly nothing in here is dogma. Certainly nothing in this text is laid down as absolute and abiding over cross-culturally and trans-historically. I do think much of this is grounded in the biological realities of human development and in the consistent realities of development. So I'm going to at least bow to the clinical experience that we have that seems fairly consistent. So in the development of gay and lesbian dynamics, Scharff's position is clear, that there is family patterns that facilitate, that privilege that, and there are family patterns that militate against that, that seem to track individuals into heterosexual or into homosexual dynamics. That's a problem for some people, simply because, and let me use the extreme versions because for academic purposes that's the most obvious and the easiest. In the, call it the radical gay rights movement, everyone seems to want and demand that we accept that biology drives the train, that gay and lesbian dynamics are inherently biologically based. And the reason for that desire is quite simple. If it's biological, then it can be shoehorned into the 1964 Civil Rights Act, which would equate then sexual orientation to skin color and other categories against which discrimination is effectively illegal. On the other side, we have the, call it conservative religious right, if you will, and their position that gay and lesbian dynamics are entirely learned. If that's the case, they say, they can be unlearned. You can be treated. It's equated in effect to bank robbery, behaviors that can be punished, behaviors that can be understood and changed. Treatment can be given and people can be changed at that level. And I'm saying a pox on both their houses, that they're both wrong. There is no data that I have ever seen or heard of that suggests there's any purely biological way of thinking about complex human behavior, and there's certainly no behaviors that are unconnected from a biological foundation, a genetic foundation. Scharff's position effectively is there is a great deal of both going on simultaneously, and we have to give both areas their due. I think he does privilege to some degree the developmental dynamics, and I think that's an inescapable conclusion to his readings. We do see, and I have to give him some credit and some credit for recognizing that developmental patterns do seem to consistently have some result. Now, this is not causation in any valid scientific way, but we can't deny trends in development that seem to produce consistent results. Much more research is necessary to come to any hard conclusions. One of the things that he suggests briefly is patients, and he touches here on just a handful of the categories in the new Diagnostic and Statistical Manual 5 that are considered mental illnesses, disorders of sexual functioning, or the paraphilias. He describes, again, all too briefly, patients who come forward for sex change surgery. The name now has been changed to gender dysphoria as opposed to gender identity disorder in the previous edition of the DSM. One of the changes in the DSM that seems interesting on the sexuality subjects is that gender identity disorder in DSM-4 was considered a mental illness, and it still is. The difference is how it's characterized now. As I read this material, and there hasn't been a great deal of research since the publication of the DSM-5, I look forward to reading it as it develops. They seem to have one significant change in the categories besides the name, and that's they've allowed the subjective experience of the individual who feels gender incongruence to determine that individual's status as a disorder or not. The subjective experience causing distress to the person seems to be the key factor in determining its status as a dysfunction or not. And I don't know that there are too many other categories of mental illness where the individual's own response determines the status as opposed to objective criteria, or at least independent criteria. It would make no sense to say, if a person is suffering from delusions, that if in the context of those delusions, part of the delusion was that the person was just fine, or in fact, Emperor Napoleon. But if the person wasn't distressed by those, we would not say they're not delusional. So there's some recent changes in the DSM that are still to be sorted out, I think. This is the primary one that I can see now. The problem is most of the literature up to now has suggested that folks who request sex change surgery do have fairly consistently, and in Scharff's terms, generally have a deficient ego organization on the borderline narcissistic or even psychotic level. While Robert Stoller holds that there is such a person as a true transsexual who feels he or she has been truly a member of the opposite sex from very early childhood and who need not be significantly disturbed, most writers have agreed that the early parent-child relationships, both of such, quote, true transsexuals and the larger group who seek sex reassignment as a surgical solution to a psychological upset, all have significantly disturbed mother-child and father-child relationships. I think the data shows that. And what we have here is an interesting dichotomy between a possibility of a true transgender individual and what appear to be in the literature the vast majority who are significantly disturbed individuals, regardless of how they themselves claim to perceive the internal conflicts. Again, political issue, difficult issue sociologically, but that's the edge of where we are now. Let's move to chapter 10, which is entitled Adolescent Precursors of Sexual Relationships. In case you haven't noticed up to now, what Dr. Scharff is doing is moving throughout the entire text from earliest childhood development to old age and all of the developmental milestones throughout the lifespan, and focusing on the sexual development at that particular time and place and under those circumstances. And I need to reiterate here, and I will come back to this at the end of his text, that sexuality is not a thing. You don't have a sex life. You have a orientation to sex, sexuality, to yourself and to those with whom you are in relationship, including your children, that has all around it, pervasively through it, components of sexuality which change over time, sometimes rather significantly. And so your relationship to sexuality, the relationship to sexuality and your identity is not a static quantity. It's an evolving, relational, dynamic quality. And this is the most important part. It involves the internalized object relational dynamics, the unconscious, developmental, internalized parents. It involves the person at whatever level they're at developmentally in the here and now. And it involves those persons with whom the individual is in relationship and that person's internal object world from their developmental dynamics. Sex life now, it turns out, is an incredibly complicated thing. But if you don't understand that, if you think it's just a thing you do, if you think it is just the sum total of your sexual acts, you have almost no ability to affect it, to develop it, to improve it, to recognize where perhaps it needs help, to recognize certainly occasionally where it goes very, very wrong. You have no ability to intervene in the lives of adolescents who are just forming their pre-adult sexual experiences. So this is a plea for a much more comprehensive look, a much more deep and complex look at the meaning of sexuality in all of our lives. Chapter 10 is about how adolescents begin that process of the more adult sexual development. Now, the thing about adolescent development is that we have this stage where after the Oedipus complex, after the complex sexual dynamics around ages 3, 4, 5 get resolved, hopefully, we enter into a latency phase where sexuality, which has appeared quite overt in young children, gets repressed. Adolescence hits. We have the hormonal, physical, emotional development driving young adolescents into a kind of almost healthy narcissism, a egocentrism, there's also a component of sort of a moralism that adolescents are righteous quite frequently. And all of this in the context of budding, uncertain, complex sexuality, that we have this explosion of previously repressed Oedipal sexual dynamics in the context of all these other physiological and emotional changes. What we have is radical change on top of a developmental grounding in the child's history that remains consistent. And one of the first things that happens is that adolescents discover masturbation, both boys and girls. Scharff describes accurately, I think, the consistent, what he calls the central masturbation fantasy that young boys and girls gravitate toward. They seem consistent. They have a way of thinking about sexuality while they masturbate. And here we have to again hold clearly that what is happening has something to do with the physical pleasure of orgasm and its release. But that's only the tip of the iceberg. Masturbation in adolescence is a vehicle for ego integration. It is a vehicle, a transitional space, a transitional experience between primary object and love object. And what that means is how the child has taken in the parental objects, how his character has been formed around that developmental space internally, now populated by parental objects. And how now in this, again, physical, genetic, hormonal, emotional development of adolescence, reaching out for the first time in a sexualized way, fully sexualized way, to another object, an other out there. That masturbation idea is tied to the adolescent's ability to do that. It is an important developmental dynamic. If it is punished, if it is shamed, if it is morally forbidden, the child experiences developmental catastrophe. If it is uncontained, if it is allowed without limitation, if it is unrestricted in any absolute way at all, or any minimal way, the damage is just as great. We have a situation here, and this is the take-home lesson for adolescent masturbation issues, where rigid moral restrictions, punishment, shaming are disastrous for the child's development. But unrestricted, permissive, utter lack of containing environment and boundaries to the child's growing developmental self results in a dissipation of ego identity that's just as damaging as the moralization. Transitioning from masturbation to actual sexual activity has to be restricted in adolescence. The idea that we have in our culture now, which is the mere image of the problem in Freud's day, where Victorian morality restricted sexuality, forbid it, in fact, in ways that were just utterly destructive. We now have the utterly destructive, permissive, if it feels good, do it, there are no boundaries, let them have fun, let them be free. This seems like a symptom, a reaction of the prior regression, not a healthy way of thinking about adolescent development. And what we found consistently, and what Scharff, I think, in very direct ways confirms with his research, is that adolescents who have premature actual sexual activity are always damaged by it. We have to look at the transition from masturbation to sexual activity, and we have to stay aware that we are not talking about behaviors here. We're talking about the meaning of these things. We're talking about the level of maturity. That has to be addressed. young adolescents who may have the physical capacity for masturbation, who may have the physical capacity to have sexual intercourse with another, if they do not have the emotional maturity, if they haven't been contained by a loving household environment, then that physical activity will simply be another symptom of their sexual immaturity and neurotic lack of containment. It will generate more problems than it solves. We have to get beyond the look at just merely looking at the physical behaviors, the sex, in a narrow way, and look at it in the context of the adolescent's development. So go back to the masturbation for a minute. We have to be sophisticated. We have to look at these things. Several questions, and I challenge parents with adolescents to answer these questions directly. I challenge adults to look back on their own adolescent experience with masturbation and ask these questions of themselves. Number one, how did the patient react to the onset of masturbation in adolescence? Was the first ejaculation for the boy and the rediscovery of clitoral sensitivity for the girl traumatic, pleasurable, or guilt-ridden? The answer to those questions are huge. They will track the adolescent's maturing growth and development down very different roads. We need to understand why their reaction was traumatic, pleasurable, or guilt-ridden, or we cannot help them. Number two, what was the kind of relationship to objects, including family of origin, peers, and future objects? What was the kind of relationship to objects in the child's mind? What is the nature of their connection? How do they relate to themselves, to others, to family? What's the nature of the family dynamic? That's going to inform the nature of the primary masturbation fantasy. We need to understand what that is. Number three, were there competing fantasies which attacked or modified the central masturbation fantasy? And how were they dealt with? There is no question that in every one of us, and most assuredly in adolescents discovering sexuality, rediscovering sexuality, that there are cross currents of hostility, aggression, sadism. Are those being evoked in the masturbation fantasy? If so, why? How? In what particular way? That must be addressed and understood if the child's sexual development is going to avoid the kind of traumatic hostility and violence that often derails subsequent adult development into dysfunction and the paraphilias or perversions. Number four, how long was the masturbation continued and how did it blend with later sexual experience? The idea here is that it will in fact blend, that there is a transition from the asexual latency period to a masturbation phase of early adolescence and a transition to more adult, mature sexual relating. We need to understand that transition as well. The role of sex in adolescence is understood by Scharff as a getting ready, as a practice, as a transition. One of the things he talks about, I think way too briefly, is what happens when adolescents begin having sex before they're mature enough to manage the complex reality emotionally of the sexual experience. And he says very clearly that their development, emotional development, maturing is inevitably derailed in significant ways. What happens in addition if there is a pregnancy? What happens if a young man becomes a father? And obviously, what happens if a young woman becomes a mother at a time when she isn't even a full-grown woman herself? Scharff's answer, somewhat harsh, but I think inescapably must be addressed, is that teenage pregnancy is itself a symptom of failed parenting on the part of the adolescent. This is harsh. This causes us, this is one of those bits of research that generates anger and frustration and even hatred and an attack on the researchers. But one has to suggest, if the data suggests it, then we have to at least think about the possibility that a young girl getting pregnant is saying something about her inadequate, mature, internalized objects, that she is doing something that reflects an immaturity and failure of her parents to themselves achieve a healthy maturity, which then obviously cannot be transferred to the child. We have then children having children as a symptom of emotional developmental failure at multiple generations. The phrase is the intergenerational transmission of trauma. I think teenage pregnancy reflects an inescapable conclusion that there has been and continues, sadly, to be too many examples of intergenerational transmission of trauma, and everyone in this case suffers. His conclusion in chapter 10 is that sex can damage the adolescent development if it's too early, that we have to look at the maturity level of the individual, not the behavior, that sex is not always good, that sex may feel physically pleasurable, but if it isn't in the context of emotional development and internalization of a mature, loving object relationship, it inevitably results in derailed development. And with some trepidation, I say, it is always an enactment of the parental dynamics. All right, chapter 11. Breaking in bodily aspects of bonding in courtship and marriage. Okay, so how does, assuming we can get beyond adolescent development, and now we're young adults attempting courtship and marriage and all that comes with that, how do we think about sort of mate selection in that context? And the issue of role of sex during courtship, falling in love, decision-making processes, and getting married. Well, it seems clear that love, what's the old saying? Love is a many splendored thing. People fall in love and everything is wonderful and the partner that you love is perfect, ideal, and everyone seems to recognize that there's something wrong with that picture. And Scharff, I think, correctly identifies the idealization dynamic. That when we fall in love, the bad things in us and our partner are split off and projected outside this little cocoon of love and safety and wonderfulness in the relationship. But that's not realistic. We have bad in us as well as good. We have harsh, punitive objects in both of us. And it is an illusion, and it is sometimes a symptom to split them off. It seems in some ways inevitable that a new relationship, at the very least, if we can think of it in a positive light, puts their best foot forward, accentuates the positive, and that's how the love gets started. And we do sort of blindly go into a newfound love with this aura of fantasied, idealized other. Okay. At some point, reality hits. And what Scharff's talking about is the psychic reality of our internal world. We have bad objects within us up until the relationship becomes solidified and there's a certain phase of idealization where the bad object gets projected. What happens is the bad object can't be projected anymore, and things inevitably are revealed to be conflictual. There is no perfect relationship. The sad reality is that the Greeks were probably a little bit right about tragedy. It is not human nature to be perfectible. We remain within ourselves creatures filled with aggression and hostility, hopefully overlaid with enough love and strength and care and empathy and courage to face reality and the reality of our own internal difficulty sometimes and that of our partners. But inevitably, in late adolescence and in the beginnings of courtship and marriage, one of the biggest hurdles is recognizing in the sexual sphere that these conflicts exist, and very quickly they can become one of two things in an early relationship. They can become disruptive, even destructive, if they're not addressed honestly, if we don't see what we bring to the table. Instead of projecting out onto the outside our internal problems, we begin projecting them onto the other. And that Prince Charming, who started the relationship so idealized, very quickly can become a demon from hell. And that wonderful woman who was everything you've ever dreamed about, who seemed to have no flaws, who was the princess in the ivory tower, all of a sudden now is the clawed harpy who's trying to rip your heart out. Neither of these things were ever true, but if they cannot be recognized, if that splitting process becomes focused on the partner and doesn't get contained within the individual, then the relationship will frequently fall apart, and often with great hostility. We begin relationships, and this reflects I think, the core of the article, the lecture on fusion and merger, adult love relationships. We begin all these relationships, and adolescents are no different, and adults who are coming to their second or third long-term relationship are doing exactly the same thing again. We bring our own internal processes to the relationship, and we resonate with those unconsciously who bring something similar. We never hook up with people who are substantially different than we are at the level of emotional health or pathology. There are no innocent victims in relationships. We will always gravitate toward those who reflect our own internal conflicts, and that is frequently where the problem lies. Basically, Scharff's idea is that we have to recognize that idealization cannot sustain a loving relationship, that reality will happen, and that we have to address our psychic reality elements of difficulty, aggression, hostility, own them, recognize them, realize that they are in our partner as well, and in fact are a necessary part of both of us. And the phrase I've used more than once is, if you see something in your partner now that you didn't see before that's annoying, can you take a deep breath, look them in the eye and smile and declare that that is quite certainly part of their charm? And it is actually, can it be actually a part of them seen as a whole person that can reflect something about their complexity and even their strength? This is not easy to do in the context of projective hostilities, but if you can achieve enough maturity to do that, your relationship is on the way to achieving a kind of enduring and real love, it seems to me. Chapter 12, the power of sex to sustain or disrupt a marriage. This is a fairly short and simple chapter, and the question he addresses is, I think, common in our culture. The chapter examines the myth of the couple that stays together principally on account of their sexual life. And I know we've all heard this. Well, you know, we don't like each other, but we just, the sex is too good to end the relationship. Scharff denies that's ever any realistic possibility because his understanding, and I agree with him on this, sexuality and identity can't be split apart. And so if we divorce the relationship from the physical element of the sexuality, we are denying those parts of ourselves that are necessary for health and wholeness. It ends up reflecting a sex life that is shallow, that is hollow, that is unsatisfying. Scharff describes folks in that situation almost always as ultimately quite depressed, a barren, shallow, hollow, often, frankly, hostile relationship outside the narrow physical parameters of the sex life. And in the vast majority of cases, it seems completely unsustainable in the long run. The sexuality might be the door through which a healthier relationship can be reconstructed. Good sex lives ought to be a motivation to do the other elements of the work necessary to achieve a whole and healthy, more complete, more integrated individual life and a connection to another who's also done his or her own work along those lines. But sexuality stripped of that emotional context cannot simply be the basis for any long-term meaningful relationship at all. He does have some questions here and some ideas that I think are very useful and powerful. Let's be specific about the functions of a good enough sex life in marriage. And he uses that phrase, harking back to Winnicott's The Good Enough Mother. You don't have to be perfect. It doesn't always have to be fireworks and multiple orgasms. But a good enough sex life contains the individual's loving elements, contains the hostile elements, does provide a mutual satisfaction and joy and pleasure. Specifically, what does it do? What are the functions of a good enough sex life in marriage? Number one, repair of the internal and external object damaged by ordinary wear and tear. Repair of the internal and external object. Can sexuality function that way? And the answer is yes. If we understand that the internal and external objects, that ourselves and others have this internal space, and that sexuality can function in a way to heal old unconscious developmental wounds. I think it was a travesty, that song Sexual Healing many decades ago. It suggested that sex itself, the physical external behavior of having sex, could be somehow emotionally healing. And that is not only a lie, that is a destructive lie that I think itself is a symptom of a quite disturbed sexualized mind. But let me just assume that the author of that song was really under the tutelage of Dr. Scharff here. And what he really meant by that was not just the physical sex act, but was actually a sexuality that fostered an integration and wholeness of the individual's psychic reality, of the split off objects internally. The repair of internal and external objects can be actualized in an intimate sexual relationship. Function number two, reparation, making up to the object and earning forgiveness. If I make mistakes, if I do damage, if I am harsh, unempathic, if I have hurt others, presenting sexually as an exercise in repair, it can serve that function. And that's a beautiful element. Sexuality as a compassionate attempt to make up. I think there's an element of it that's completely legitimate. Number three, renewing the overall bond and preparation for the separation which will inevitably follow. Sexuality can, looking prospectively, solidify an immediate relational bond and provide both parties with the containment necessary when separation inevitably happens. Somebody's got to get up and go to work. Somebody goes on vacation. Somebody is not there when they are needed. The memory of intimate sexuality can facilitate an internalized object relationship that remains solid even in the absence of the partner. People who violate others' boundaries in a relationship, people who check phone numbers, who check phone records, who look through pockets, who check glove compartment boxes, people who try to hack into email accounts. These are folks with insecurities. These are folks with dysfunctions and more than a little hostility in their relationship that lack the reparative and renewing function of an intimate sexuality. Their sexuality doesn't sustain them in the absence of their partner, and they become insecure and engage in these behaviors that are directly symptomatic of a failed identity, and certainly a failed sexualized identity. Number four, integration of bodily drives with the overall current of the marriage. There is no question that there is a genetic, biological component to sexuality. It involves the body at the most primitive level and the mind at the highest levels. There's an integration here, and sexuality ought to facilitate that integration of the body, not just into the act of physical sex, but into the relationship between the two people themselves. The fifth and sixth elements are a little more psychoanalytic. Number five, striving to satisfy the critical and standard-setting aspects of internal objects. Now, what this is referencing is the standard sort of superego idea or the idealized parental object inside of us, that we have standards internally, and we ought to achieve a certain level of sexual intimacy and a certain level of pleasure in our sexual life, and those standards are often hard to meet. A healthy sexuality will meet them to a large extent. And that sets up a sense of satisfaction and contentment within the self that's quite important. Lastly, number 6, making up for the deficiencies which are felt in the internal objects and in the corresponding aspects of the self, so as to reflect a more positive self-image, particular in comparison to the ego ideal. And I think in some ways that last one, again, apologize for the technical language, but the idea is quite simple, that if we can use a healthy sexuality to take us to the next level of emotional integration, then it might actually facilitate our internal growth and development, that there is a developmental element to a healthy sexuality that itself facilitates. It isn't just the result of a healthy sexuality. It can actually facilitate emotional development in that direction as well. And that ought to be true in all of our cases. All right, finally for this chapter, I think he's right in kind of a common sense summary. If sex is a problem, very quickly it becomes a very big problem. If it's not a problem, if it is good enough generally, then it becomes just another aspect to the relationship. And I think what that involves, what that suggests, is that if you can ask yourself this in the relationship you're in, what is the nature of our sex life? And if it's mostly okay, mostly good enough, then that's a suggestion that something appropriate is happening in your couple and in your development internally. But if it's a problem, it's likely to be a big problem in the relationship, and that gives you an indication of where to look for help. So, he summarizes the functions of sex in marriage. When sex is available as a resource in a marriage, it operates at conscious and unconscious levels to give pleasure, to promote and renew the bond between a couple, to offer reassurance in times of stress, and to act as a healing and integrating force. That's how it's supposed to be. If it's not that way, it can be the sign of a failure of interdependency, of a failure to fulfill the needs which are left from earlier years, or the inability to respond to the assault on developmental changes. A husband's looking for an affair or a wife's loss of a sexual interest are signs of important failures of intimacy. Lack of a sexual life exerts an additional powerful force for the dissolution of the marriage by setting new forces for disruption into action. These are the dangers. If those dangers are to be avoided, Scharff says that we have to recognize where those dangers are from and what they truly mean. They will have to suspend, the couple will have to suspend, at least temporarily, the sense of injury and frustration previously felt at each other's hands. To the extent that they are able to do so, sex can offer a tool for reconstruction. To the extent they cannot, sex will remain powerless to help. What that means here, the take-home lesson in this chapter is very simple but very difficult in execution. If you can get to the point where you can feel your sexual life to be the sum total of these internal histories, and that you can stop blaming the other for their failure, their inadequacy, their withholding, that if you can recognize that inevitably projective processes are in play and that you and he or she are bringing everything that is a problem in the relationship sexually in between you together, and that it's nobody's fault, but that it must be understood at this deeper level, then and only then is it possible for you to do the repair and use the physical intimacy as a vehicle toward growth and not as yet another reason to attack and accuse the other. The potential here is both dangerous and beautiful. Let us move on to chapter 13, Facing the Brink, Sex and Separation. And I think this one's also fairly simple and straightforward. What happens when sexuality is incompatible? What happens when the individuals are incompatible? Because there is no distinguishing those two things. There's a quote from John Bowlby at the beginning of chapter 13. The person trusted provides a secure base from which his or her companion can operate. And the more trustworthy the base, the more it is taken for granted. And the more it is taken for granted, unfortunately, the more likely it is its importance, the more likely is its importance to be overlooked and forgotten. Here's the great trap. There is nothing more painful in the human life than the loss of a loved object. I challenge anybody to look at how their lives have been and look at the moments of greatest pain. And I think Scharff summarizes it perfectly in one sentence. Loss of the loved object is the most painful of human experiences. I don't know too many people who've experienced divorce who don't say that that was the worst experience of their life. I suppose if someone's been horribly injured, disfigured, terrible accidents, I suppose that would be in that category, but only something that extreme equals the psychic, terrible emotional pain of loss of a loved object, loss of a marriage, loss of a significant other that's had been thought to be in a deep and meaningful relationship. Again, sexuality can be the source of healing or the source of aggression that threatens the connection. He describes the sequence of events sexually that result after a separation. The first is almost a kind of panic. There's often then a denigrating of the self. If someone leaves me, I attack them. But just as frequently, it must be my fault. There's a self-destructive dynamic involved. An internalization of hate and the destruction that was first projected out onto the other. People act sexually in the context of a threatened relationship. They can become hypersexual. They can withdraw in an extreme aversive way. They can become promiscuous. They can become shut down. The sexual component in a threat to a relationship is central to how that relationship ultimately is restored or how it falls apart. He ends chapter 13 with a brief note on the children of parents who separate. And though this is the wrong section or wrong lecture to go into this in much detail, it seems clear that parents whose sexuality and character becomes incompatible and resulting in divorce do untold amounts of damage to the children. I think in another lecture I actually came to the hideous conclusion that divorce is child abuse, and that we need to recognize the truth of that statement in order to protect both ourselves and our children. More on that later. What happens to those children as parents, to children of parents with sexual dysfunction? That is the summary title of chapter 14, Children of Parents with Sexual Dysfunction. And he starts with a quote from Freud. If there are quarrels between the parents, or if their marriage is unhappy, the ground will be prepared in their children for the severest predisposition to a disturbance of sexual development or to neurotic illness. That's Freud writing in his 3 essays on sexuality in 1905, and I think that's absolutely undisputably true. A conflict between the parents becomes the psychic reality that the children take in inevitably. If parents don't understand that a sexual dislocation in the marriage, a relational dislocation, arguments, fights, disagreements, conflict, the atmosphere in the home, if it's rife with sexual tension, if it's rife with overt hostility, aggression, and if it ultimately obviously falls apart, the child is taking in all of that aggression, sexuality in its dysfunctional forms. All of the difficulties of the parents in their relational dynamic are being taken in by the child as the model for its own relational dynamic. There is no way around this, folks. This is painful data. This is painful conclusions to come to, but there's no way around it. I work with adolescents all the time, and I have never seen a case yet, and my colleagues who work with adolescents consistently report that they can do nothing with the adolescents, or they can start helping the adolescents, but if they're forced to send the adolescents back into a poisonous household out of which the pathology was generated, they can make no meaningful progress. Work with adolescents inevitably entails work with the parents. If you can't get the parents to change their poisonous dynamic, if you can't get them to change their own object relational character, the children are in grave difficulty. And I have seen endless cases of parents coming in with children with problems, and the parents seem to believe there's some chemical imbalance in their brain. The parents want me to fix them as if they have a bad case of the flu. They do not want to see, are in denial about their own contribution to the adolescent's difficulties. And truly, in adolescent development, the first thing that has to be addressed is the parent's pathology. Without that, there is not much help to be had for the poor adolescent. And I think we can move on from that. Chapter 15. He takes a little turn in chapter 15, the effects of the child's development on parental sexuality. Now, we've moved into adult couples who have children. What happens to them? What happens to their relationship? I've been talking in one direction almost from the beginning. What effect do the parents have on the children? Well, Scharff spends a chapter thinking about and trying to understand what effect the children have on the parents. It's clearly not equal. It's clearly not a balanced provision of influence here. The overwhelming majority of the influence is going from parents to child. But there's no doubt, and Scharff is clear about this, and I agree with him on this one, that the presence of a child inevitably causes some significant changes in the parents' relationships. You can never be a non-parent again, and that changes the parents. You've had complete access to your partner, unimpinged on by any others outside your immediate status as a couple, but now you do. There's a third. And what's interesting is that Oedipal dynamics inevitably get re-evoked in the parents when the presence of this third person, their child, happens. If they have not managed their own mature separation from their parents, what we find is astonishingly accurate recreations of the parents' own Oedipal development in the presence of their child with the other partner. There's almost a forced reworking of their own developmental issues. And the question becomes, can the couple see that happening? Can they recognize it? Can the father provide the containment for the mother's working with the child and containing the child? Can the needs of the father be put on hold as he provides this protecting and providing atmosphere of containment? Can the mother focus on the child's needs, and can she be strong enough and in her internal world contained enough to provide that all-important connection to the child's mind? These are dramatically different relational dynamics than the couple had when it was just the couple. There are questions of dependency and responsibility that get reworked that are absolutely essential. You don't just have children now. You have a psychic reworking of profound developmental dynamics in both the parents that are astonishingly accurately recreated with their own children. And this is both a source of strength if you can see it happening, but it can also tear families apart if you don't see it happening. There's one clinical sort of reality that I've seen over and over, and several of my colleagues have acknowledged and commented on seeing something similar. And there's variations on this theme all over the place, but the basic model is this. If when you were a child, your parents got divorced at about age 11, let's say, and then you survive that and you do some work and you get married and you have a child, and that child starts approaching age 11. It is astonishing how many marriages break up at about the time one or both partners, at about the time the child of those partners hits the same age the parents were when their parents divorced. The reenactment of the disruptive marriage of the grandparents gets reenacted in the parents when they, in a way, counter-identify with their own child, the child of a broken up family at that particular age. It's an astonishing thing to watch, and a tragedy of a failure to recognize the power of the unconscious objects. If parents could be shown these things, if they could get enough of their own therapy to recognize that this is the plane upon which their own dynamics are being reenacted. And it's not about whatever superficial conflict they think they're arguing about. A lot of marriages might be saved, and a lot of children might not be hurt as badly as they often are when that marriage falls apart in a way that seems now so unnecessary. Chapter 16, Sex and the Midlife Crisis, also a short chapter. And I think the short version of this is quite simple. There isn't any such thing as a midlife crisis. There's no documented biological, genetic, hormonal thing that we can point to that suggests a midlife crisis is some normal developmental sequence inevitable in human development. It simply isn't. It appears to be a time where previously failed developmental dynamics become activated because of a particular developmental time in life. But it says more about the person's earlier development than it does about where they are then. Things happen that they cannot tolerate because of fragmented, fractured, unintegrated dynamics in their internal object world, because there is too much projection, too much denial. They have held it together up till now, and life events, often the reality of aging, often the reality of their dwindling youth, evokes in them a type of manic denial. And this is where the stereotype happens. The guy runs off from his wife of 20 years and marries his secretary and gets a Corvette, or other ridiculous things like that. We see those things happen, and they seem absurd and ridiculous and tragic and destructive as they can be. But underneath them appears to lie an object relational constellation that has always had these fault lines running through it. And the maturing dynamic that ought to result in a solidification of mature adult functioning, that ought to be the vehicle for a proud and profound acceptance of life and a looking back on life's achievements with some dignity and some pride, are now seen as disasters that have to be avoided, threats that have to be defended against with manic acting out behaviors, and that a mind tentatively held together can unravel in the face of the reality of what ought to be, in a better case, a mature and grounded acceptance of life as it is, integrated acceptance of limited possibilities, but honest possibilities of real life lived to its fullest, and the manic need or the depressive need or the idealization need to have everything all the time, to deny the loss, often generates disruptive behaviors and destroyed relationships in ways that seem obvious now as simply denied internal dynamics that we should have gotten a handle on a long time ago. I do a lot of clinical work with couples in their 30s and 40s and individuals in their 30s and 40s who face these exact things. And the tendency, the need is to act out in denial of what's about to be lost, as a person can no longer deny that they're in their 20s. And the point at which this happens seems to be fairly clear. When you experience the stark realization that there's more time behind you than in front of you, that you have in fact reached that point and perhaps crossed that threshold of midlife, that you've lived more in the past than you're likely to live in the future, that can evoke some of these fault lines in your psychic structure that without a solid grounding can fissure and cause fragmentation. One hopes that with increasing maturity, there's increasing pride and satisfaction, even not because you've lived a perfect life, but because even if there have been trauma, even if there have been loss, and sometimes that loss is profound, the question is, have you had enough strength to overcome it, to make meaning out of it, even if it's bad and difficult? Can you rise above it to some extent? And the phrase Scharff uses that I think is just brilliantly poetic, in fact, is that some people have lost so much that they no longer fear loss, that they no longer need to fear loss because they've They've been there, done that. They've lost everything that they have, and they can rise up and affirm what's left. And that, to me, is the very definition of heroism. And I think it's possible if you can understand life using Scharff's template. Okay. 2 chapters remaining, chapter 17, Aging, Loss, and Sexual Development. And he's got what I call the happy quotes. Other than serious physical injury or illness, the research seems pretty darn clear. There is no reason why old people can't have a great deal of very satisfying sex. Now, when I say that to some of my classes, and I jokingly say, okay, imagine your grandparents having sex. People are, ooh, ick, gross, don't want to talk about it. And I stop them immediately and I say, you better not think that way, because you're going to be grandparents, you're going to be that old sometime, and do you really want to give up a vibrant sex life? And they get quiet very quickly when that happens and realize, well, no. Well, then why would you deny that to your parents and grandparents? And the idea is what they're denying is the inevitability of their own aging. So the take-home lesson here is the only thing necessary is a reasonably good state of general health and an interested and interesting partner. Into your 80s and 90s, ladies and gentlemen, there is no reason why sexuality shouldn't be a vibrant and exciting and passionate part of everyone's life, regardless of their age. Brief chapter on the dynamics of extramarital sex. He wants to address if we're talking about the full spectrum of adult sexuality, there's obviously enough of extramarital sex going on that we ought to talk about its meaning in the context of adult sexuality generally. He wants to be open-minded. He wants to be broad in his cultural sensibilities. He wants to be open to the possibilities of multiple ways of thinking about this. And at the end of the day, he can't. At the end of the day, I think he comes back to the biological, grounded, emotional, psychic reality that an extramarital affair is a symptom of immature functioning, that it takes out of the marriage an opportunity for sexual growth and maturing. It is often a hostile thing, blaming and revenge-oriented and quite aggressive. It is involving often a secret that reflects back to primitive, unresolved Oedipal dynamics. And I think his conclusion, and there may be disagreements here, but the inescapable conclusion at least has to be addressed, that there is a good chance in many, if not most cases. And Scharff, despite his attempt to sort of stay open to the possibility that this isn't a bad thing entirely, ends up concluding that it is a bad thing entirely, that it is a sad failure of maturity, that if there's a conflict in the relationship around sexuality or other issues, it ought to be resolved in the intimate, mature relational dynamic between the couple. Get the help you need is the request here. That an affair represents an inappropriate and immature acting out of primitive developmental dynamics that reflect a lack of character, a mental illness function, at the very least some kind of symptom of the person's inadequate development. Not a lot of folks are going to be happy to hear that, but that appears to be the data that requires at least an honest self-assessment of. Okay, to wrap this up, chapter 19, and this is a very short chapter, and it is the penultimate chapter, and I think it bears reading and rereading, toward a framework for sexual maturity. What constitutes mature sexuality in the context of the link between the inner and outer worlds? That's the repeated theme throughout this text. All that comes early in development is included and give harmonious expression in such a union. Mature sexuality is not the expression of a sexual biological drive or the quality of orgasm. sex is one example of play at differential levels of development. Sexuality is not a fixed quantity, a permanent achievement, or just a behavior, right? It's a developing capacity for the level of sexual exchange appropriate at each stage of life. It never belongs to the individual alone. It exists in a relationship between two people, and in a larger sense, in the family in which they live and relate, and I would suggest even in a larger context, the families that have come before. It is about individuals, the families, and the overall relationship both to each other and to their internal object world. And he describes accurately, I think, the progression towards sexual maturity at the very end of the text. 4 stages. Number 1, the earliest level of maturation relates to sexual interest stemming from an interest in one's own body as experienced with the mother of early attachment. Now this is pure pleasure. This is the infant in the mother's arms, entirely focused on the erotic elements of its body's movement, entirely focused on the embodied connection between the mother and the child. It has its equal in adult sexual relating. The second level is that of sexual interest stemming from an interest in the mother of separation as object. The baby, at the separation individuation phase, sees the mother as finally an independent separate object, is curious about that object. There's the beginnings of intimacy which require separation. There's no intimacy if you're not separate from the object. So in terms of sexuality, intimacy is only a possibility when two whole people are actually separate. This is the very definition of pathology in relationships that Judy Ecoff described as fusion-oriented, where inadequate internal psychic structure of two people, basically two people half-formed, glom onto each other, and the relationship becomes a substitute for their identity. This is a hostile position and a dangerous one, and when it inevitably breaks up, it generates great anxiety and rage and fear and often violence. So pleasure first in the symbiotic oneness with a mother figure, intimacy, the ability to separate and feel a oneness at a distance, to recognize the other as separate and yet in an intimate connection. Level 3. It is only at the third level, sexual interest stemming from Oedipal relationships, that cooperation and mutual sexual satisfaction are generally in mind. So one has to resolve the Oedipus situation in a healthy way in order to achieve cooperation, in order to achieve a truly intimate, other-directed, and simultaneously self-directed sexual, powerful, erotic, orgasmic pleasure, intimacy, and cooperation, this third level, which requires the recognition of the other as separate and inevitably the possibility of a third, the child. And that is the fourth level. 4. Once this achievement is possible, a couple has a base on which to build toward the family achievements which stem from successful latency and adolescent growth, the sublimated investment in children, work, and the creative products of intimacy, cooperation, and secure self-reliance. This is the pinnacle of internalized, integrated wholeness, all of which in an intimate, physically manifested sexuality, in the context of self, self with other, self in the context of a larger family dynamic, all of which reinforce the loving sexual and sensuality of the couple and their internal couples, which are the core of their then projected ability to be in a family and to allow the child to take in the loving couple, the sexual couple. Here's the take-home lesson. If parents don't have this kind of loving sexual life between them, they cannot be good parents. No parents without a healthy sexuality can provide the child with what they need to develop their own adult sexuality. Again, a disturbing idea, but the only way that makes sense in providing the child developmentally what they need, what we all need. Adults need this themselves. My sense is that Scharff is providing us here with the theoretical bedrock upon which to build lives of healthy wholeness, intimate sexuality, a mutual loving care and concern, and a household that raises children in the context of appropriate sexuality, loving, committed care, and a type of connected autonomy that provides the child with everything they need to go down the road to the next generation, to basically stop the intergenerational transmission of trauma. And for parents to look not just to their children, but to look toward the grandchildren. If they can use this material to achieve that individual goal, maybe in their childhoods they got derailed by parents who didn't understand this stuff. It is up to parents now, using this way of thinking, to fix and to heal their own gaps, their own inconsistencies, to help each other do that. And if they can, they have the potential for a beautiful life. And maybe as important, they have the potential to grant that as the greatest gift to their children. If you can achieve this kind of integrated, whole, loving sexuality, then at the end of your life, you will be one of those grandparents who has maintained a loving sexual excitement about life. This is the payoff for surviving and growing from trauma and loss. This is the payoff for doing the hard work of intimate growth individually and together. Both a life at the end filled with beauty and joy and intimacy and pleasure physically and joy emotionally, and the ability to give that to the generations that come. Dr. Scharff's material bears reading and rereading, and I commend it to you and wish you a happy, healthy sexual life. Thank you very much.